Hello, so my name's Tom, I work for WWF. The question that William asked me to address was this one, which I guess is, my starting point I suppose is, I pick up very much from what we've just heard, that individual action as consumers isn't going to be enough, that we're going to need structural interventions. So my interest is really in what is it that motivates structural interventions? What is it that motivates political change, ambitious political change? And within that, the question that William asked me to address was the extent to which appeal to economic motivations. Sorry.
Can you speak up, please?
I'm sorry. Yes. Within that, the question that I want to address is the extent to which economic imperatives can be seen to motivate structural change and political change. Thank you. So, at outset, perhaps the hopes aren't great. But I think in responding to a sentiment as captured here in this Daily Mail piece, we need to be careful to differentiate between two possible responses. There's a response of saying, well, actually, green isn't crap. The environment is important for a number of reasons. Or there's a response of saying, well, actually, it may be that green's crap, but that doesn't really matter, because in the course of addressing environmental challenges, we can also simultaneously meet economic ones. So we can pursue the economic concerns primarily, and the environmental benefits will kind of fall out in the process. Now, of course, mainstream environmental organisations adopt both approaches, but many, and perhaps increasingly, they appeal to the second of those. This is a broadsheet advertisement that a number of development and environmental organisations, my own included, put out recently, essentially making the case, there's no mention there really of the environment, making the case that the economic argument alone is sufficient to drive, ought to be sufficient to drive political will and momentum to address, to invest in renewables. I want to suggest there are three problems with this approach. The first one, I think, is relatively trivial. Non-environmental imperatives often bite you from behind. Think of shale gas, for example, carbon bed methane extraction. Here's David Cameron in Davos earlier this year, extolling the virtues of investment in shale from the perspective of the contribution that it's going to make to GDP. The economic appeal to the economic imperative is an untrustworthy friend if we're hoping to drive environmental change through it. The second problem is that I think the claimed economic justifications often just provide cover for a deeper and more ideological commitment to a particular course of action. And here I want you to cast your mind back, if you were familiar with it at the time, to the campaigns that a number of environmental NGOs ran against the expansion of Heathrow. This is, I guess, 5 or 6 years ago, when several of them commissioned a report from an economics consultancy which crunched some figures and came up, perhaps unsurprisingly, with the suggestion that, well, in expanding Heathrow, what we're going to see is more people, more Brits, flying abroad to sunny countries to spend their pounds there, than we're going to see people flying into Britain to spend their foreign currency here. So actually, from an economic perspective, it's probably not a good policy. And at the time, I remember talking to John Stewart, who was a prominent campaigner against Heathrow expansion, who felt at the time then, when it seemed as though really the debate had more or less been won, that this economic case that the environmental organisations had advanced was really pivotal in swinging the political pendulum against Heathrow expansion. But of course, it wasn't that easy. BAA came back with their own piece of economic analysis, commissioned from a more expensive economics consultancy, suggesting that actually Heathrow expansion was going to be crucial for economic recovery. And now we're in a situation where the Airports Commission seems to be putting Heathrow expansion very firmly back on the agenda, and where it's perhaps the leading proposal in their interim report published just before Christmas. So my point is that here it seems that the political agenda is being driven by something other than hard-headed, objective political analysis. It's being driven here perhaps by conversations between George Osborne and his friends, who are very prominent proponents of Heathrow expansion. And the economics and economic analysis becomes just a political football. and again, therefore, a very untrustworthy friend when it comes to trying to motivate systemic and ambitious action on climate change. The third problem, the one I want to dwell on a little bit longer, is a psychological one. And here I want to divert slightly into some social psychology. I'm going to show you a cross-section through somebody's head, so if you're being squeamish, turn away now. This is an attempt to demonstrate what social psychologists know about how values are grouped. Values are kind of standards we carry through life which transcend particular situations and which we apply consciously or unconsciously in a wide range of different situations, and which inform, certainly not the only factor, but which inform the decisions we take, behavioural choices we make. And what this cartoon attempts to illustrate, is that values are grouped. I've shown 6 here, but probably rather more value groups than that, but you could imagine perhaps the blue balloon there representing a group of values associated with health or security or safety. These are values that are in some sense, internally consistent with one another. Or the red balloon, a set of values about an exciting life or pleasure-seeking or hedonism. But I want to focus on just 2 of these balloons. The first of those is this purple balloon up here, which represents what's sometimes called extrinsic values. So these are values which reflect a concern about social image and wealth and financial success, which again seem to bundle together, seem to be internally consistent with one another. So I want to show you what happens when you look at a broadsheet advertisement like this one. A broadsheet advertisement which is highlighting the importance of economic growth. The importance that you place on the extrinsic values there increases. But notice that again, because as the importance on those extrinsic values increases, the importance that we place on the values represented there by the green balloon decreases. The green balloon represents what are called intrinsic values. These are values up here. They're values of universalism or benevolence, values of friendship or helpfulness, social justice or broad-mindedness. There's environmental protection in there as well, but again, these are a constellation of values, and as you'll see in a moment, activating one seems to spill over into activating others. And they're in this kind of dynamic tension, if you like. There's a seesaw relationship between those and these values down here, the extrinsic values associated with wealth and authority and social recognition, financial success. So I just want to show you a couple of studies which illustrate this. This is one that we commissioned from a colleague of Lorraine's in Cardiff, Greg Mayo, and a linguist at Lancaster, Paul Chilton. And we surveyed 700 people in the Cardiff area for the values they held to be important, and we chose from those 30 people who were particularly oriented to those more extrinsic values. Social image and financial success were particularly important to them. And then we asked them to spend a few minutes. We divided them into 2 groups, and we asked half of them to spend a few minutes writing about the importance to them of intrinsic values, self-acceptance, affiliation to friends and family, and broad-mindedness. We asked the other half to spend a few minutes writing about the importance to them of extrinsic values, popularity, image and wealth. Notice no mention here of the environment. I think that's important. And then we interviewed them about a range of issues, including child mortality in developing countries and climate change. And we sent those interviews, we transcribed them, and we sent them blind to the linguist up in Lancaster, who analysed them, coded them, not knowing what the priming condition that the participants had undergone. What he found was that those who'd been with these are all more extrinsically oriented people, remember, these are all people who are concerned more than average about wealth and social status. But inviting those people to reflect for a few moments on the importance of those intrinsic values led them to be significantly more likely to say that somebody should act to address climate change or child mortality in developing countries. Here are a couple of examples of what they said. So on child mortality, people who were invited to think about those more extrinsic values, participants have, and it's part of life over there, it's a way of life, that's what happens, so it's nothing to get too upset about. Or a person who's more oriented towards these more intrinsic values, I think they should stop. I mean, bonuses and the bankers, and it's publicised on the news, for goodness sake, it's back to the haves or have-nots. And on climate change, the extrinsically planned person, what would motivate me? I suppose money, if there was a financial incentive to be more proactive. I do tend to switch things off, but that's more a case of me saving money and electricity than thinking, oh, that's going to help save the world. or the more intrinsically, the person who's primed intrinsically, I do think that the earth and the environment is precious and valuable. I think it should be at the top of the political agenda. I think that the world that we pass on to the next generation, you know, is our responsibility. They're always struggling to get it out. This is an extrinsically oriented person, remember, and yet they get there. It's our responsibility. A second study, very quickly, which shows this, a guy called Tim Kasser, American professor, invited people into his lab, Americans, and he invited them to reflect on their national identity, either as Americans or as Americans, given that America's a country with where you can be an entrepreneur and make a lot of money and which has a record of international competitiveness, or as an American, given that America's a country with a long tradition of helping other countries and of strong family values. The intrinsic prime, the intrinsic framing of American identity. Notice again, no mention of the environment. And then he asked them to recommend ecological footprints for Americans in 5 years' time. And he found that those who were oriented towards this more intrinsic aspect of their national identity recommended significantly lower footprints. These differences are significant. This difference isn't significant. So what he found rather depressingly for him as an American was that actually inviting people to think about their identity as an American was every bit as unhelpful in terms of increasing their concern about environmental issues as it was inviting them to think about their identity as Americans framed in this more extrinsic way of America being an internationally competitive entrepreneurial country. So it seems the way we construe our identity, our national identity, the conversations that we have nationally about who we are and what we value collectively are crucially important in terms of shaping the collective concern that we express about social and environmental issues. But there are reasons for real hope here. Repeatedly, studies find that people, when you ask people what matters most to them, it's these more intrinsic values. It's benevolence, self-direction and universalism, which people repeatedly say are most important to them. But interestingly, when you ask people what they think the rest of their society holds to be important, they say it's the extrinsic values. So whilst we hold those more intrinsic values as individuals, we ascribe greater importance to those, when we look out to the rest of society, we'll say, well, society at large holds those more extrinsic values to be more important. Perhaps because we're picking up there on aspects in the social surround, the volume of advertising we see, the news media we see, the celebrity culture that we experience, which all serve to create the impression that it's these values which matter to most other people, even though as individuals we ascribe more importance to these. And I think that represents a real opportunity. I think it means perhaps that rather than focusing on lobbying, or rather than focusing on asking what is it that goes on in this man's head, which we might begin to influence in order to try to drive greater environmental conviction, which leads us down that route of beginning to engage on a set of economic levers, for example. Rather, perhaps we ought to be asking, what is it that gets people like these out on the streets? What is it that motivates us as individuals to write to our MPs, or to turn up to an MP's surgery, or to join a demonstration? And within that, it seems that values are quite important, and the narratives that we tell one another, the stories we create about who we are and where we're going and what we value is really important. So just a couple of implications or recommendations from this. First is that I suggest that, and this is a case that I try to make repeatedly to environmental organisations with sometimes with very limited success, but I argue that we should be spending far less time with our noses in the policymakers' trough, as it were, agonising about how we can affect incremental change on the current policy agenda, and should rather be stepping back from that and asking, well, how is it that we begin to connect with people at large? How is it that we could begin to connect with popular motivations in a way which we could actually foresee leading to an enlargement of political space and pressure for the ambitious changes that we actually know are going to be needed? The level of change is very difficult to foresee when you're constraining yourself to work within what's currently politically possible. How might we do that? Well, the first thing we might do is to celebrate the importance that most people place on intrinsic values, something which isn't generally legitimised in many public fora, something which I think third sector could importantly contribute to. The other thing we might do is begin to ask, well, what factors are there that can strengthen intrinsic values? We can come back to this in the discussion if you like, but a series of recommendations about things that might be quite signal, important points of intervention socially, which may be far removed from the environmental agenda, far removed from climate change, but which nonetheless could be really important in engaging and strengthening intrinsic values. And as a corollary to that, what might we do to begin to tackle those factors which currently strengthen extrinsic habits? Thank you for listening.